We'd like to turn now to Gordon Winston as our third speaker. Our next perspective broadens the lens further into systems of energy, infrastructure, and investment that shape long-term stability. Gordon will speak to us about environment, energy, capital, and systems. He is the CEO of QGEMS Energy, a QSEC grid company. His work spans critical energy infrastructure, data security and sovereignty, and transition in economic investment. He offers a unique perspective and experience on how energy, data security, and infrastructure influence resilience, equity, and the conditions for peace. He will explain to us why energy and systems design are now core peace questions. Gordon, could we turn to you to enlighten us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to the other panelists, and of course to my mother for the opportunity to bring this important initiative further forward and advancing the breadth and scope of those participating in the Cooperative for Humanity. This initiative began a number of years with the premise that peace must be designed into systems that people rely on every day. And the name itself is really synonymous with the intersection of peace and innovation, and more importantly, the future state of the world that we all live in and will leave our children and those generations hence. My topic of discussion kind of frames that narrative, but it looks at it from the perspective of a system as a system that's built with resilience. It's one where trust and inclusion and practical durability are built into it from the onset, not as an afterthought. In exactly the same way that today the definition of peace is a variety of different cultural perspectives. I don't see it as a diplomatic achievement, but rather as a systems-based achievement. Energy today is foundational because almost every institution and service depends on reliable power. This world of the digitalization of the world that we live in today is predicated on the existence of infrastructure that doesn't fail. As infrastructure fails, it quickly becomes very fragile. Society becomes fragile, and the failure of healthcare, education, business, and community life ensues. So we broadly talk about the energy transition, but it supports peace only if it improves security, is able to address reliability, affordability, access, and fairness. And capital allocation is decisive because it determines what gets built, what gets neglected, and who actually benefits from this allocation. Investors and system builders should ask whether systems reduce fragility, whether they strengthen trust, and support long-term stability of nations, countries, municipalities. These frameworks are critical around the world. And the time that we spent early on with the University for Peace looking at circular-based economies, these frameworks were always brought to light. How do you actually address this at a local level? But from a local level, how do you further address that at a nation state level? And in each and every discussion, it became a matter of a local-based economy. You cannot have local-based economies and health systems unless, in fact, you do have underlying power, energy, and the capability of that direct improvement. In the world that we live in today, health, peace building, energy, and AI, which Mr. Minovich will talk about, are now deeply interconnected into one shared system. So the innovation itself strengthens peace when it expands resilience, access, trust, and security. And of course, it weakens peace when it concentrates power it increases exposure or leaves people more vulnerable. And the question of vulnerability is one that continues to permeate this discussion. The immediate agenda is to strengthen critical infrastructure. And by that, you also build trusted digital architecture, directing capital towards long-term resilience, and aligning with foundational principles that actually translate into a better future state. Why now? Why is this so important? Well, there are pressures today that are shaping the world within we live in, that are questioning the framework of peace-based dictate. Infrastructural vulnerabilities, energy insecurity, technological disruption, and economic instabilities now directly affect social stability. While diplomacy remains essential, it cannot by itself stabilize these fragile systems. And peace now has to be built into the infrastructure of everyday life.
Thank you, Gordon. Your work spans energy, data security, and investment strategy, including QGEM's model for an energy hypergrid concept. Could you speak to us in a little more depth about what is the clearest link between energy transition and social stability, and what a responsible peace-oriented infrastructure agenda looks like over the next 18 months?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that question, Lindsay. The power systems in the world are all under incredible duress. When the foundational grid infrastructure was built, it wasn't built with this sort of hyperscale ever envisioned. The builders of Mr. Alex Graham Bell and others almost 100 years ago never conceived of this hyperbolic, right, requirement of energy and of course power. The foundational grid was designed as an analog infrastructure, and interestingly, it remains the last bastion of analog infrastructure around the entire world. So while every sector of business and the economy have meaningfully navigated through the digitalization process, grid infrastructure remains the last bastion of analog infrastructure that has not yet gone through this same digitalization process. The demand for power or energy to power data centers, depending upon whose source, will double, triple, quadruple over the course of the next 5, 10, 20 years. There is massive global need for more energy. And it's clear that the existing infrastructure has become incredibly unstable. The hypergrid concept, Lindsay, is a pragmatic one that looks at the existing infrastructure and takes lessons from the existing migration through effectively network architecture and applies those same sort of principles into the realm of building a digital ecosystem that's actually able to support the digitalization of existing analog-based infrastructure. At its most fundamental level, what QGEMS has built is a grid edge network operating system that brings that connectivity into the future state. It's through this connectivity that we're actually able to integrate, aggregate, and orchestrate and bring better optimization to be able to optimize across and within the built environment that we currently operate within. Our discussions have now expanded into, I know Bruce mentioned earlier, space, but we're thinking about the same principal capabilities and applying them into space-based energy consumption for exactly the same reason. The motivating factor for not only business is actually to drive sustainability, but it's also to bring resilience and redundancy into the grid infrastructure and do this in such a way that provides affordability, pricing, reliability, and an energy system that does not deteriorate, and ultimately collapse.
Liz. Gordon Winston, energy, infrastructure, and environment. What can your field do to help make peace over the next 18 months?
I think that the framework that have been collectively introduced by the panelists um, is meaningfully echoed in the statement that the infrastructural capabilities must be designed with the same framework that Mark talked about. Sovereignty, security, resiliency, redundancy is terminology that needs to be implemented. Designing a system or a series of systems that address these holistically requires the convening of people like these and those participating on this call. But there's also an empirical and a pragmatic question to the enabling of this. I've come to learn in life that, ideation is simple, but translation is very, very difficult. And ultimately the commercialization of good ideas is not an easy thing. But I do believe that that's really where this discussion goes as a follow-up. How is it specifically that we can integrate and contribute to building a system that addresses many of the principles that Mark has addressed, but it's also built into the foundation of stability of the nation and the true understanding that we really don't know the breadth and scope of which the next level of, whether it's agentic AI or this sort of knowledge-based frameworks that don't have guardrails in them, the specifics of what those outcomes will be. We need a systemic approach.
Liz.